Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, I would like to follow a protocol that we always like to follow at the United Nations and elsewhere by recognizing the indigenous peoples of this land. The Mashpee Wampanoag tribe, the Wampanoag tribe of Gay Head, and the Narragansett Indian tribe, on whose traditional land we are meeting today. I would like very warmly to thank Brown and the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity in America here for this invitation. Discussing the issue of cultural heritage as a human right at our universities helps us to shed light in parts of indigenous people's lives that are obscured by lack of knowledge on the part of the mainstream culture or by systemic discrimination, actually, and cynicism of state and non-state actors. So, this is a silent emergency, or slow violence, as Rob Nixon has called it, that indigenous peoples experience through the destruction of their cultural heritage. And it's important to see this very human aspect of the issue, appreciate its gravity and the reasons behind it, and try to build a different paradigm, one based on justice. And academia has a role to play in this. That's why I'm very happy that I got this invitation. Thank you, Maria Elena and the Center. Examples looming in our minds these days are the threats to Bears Ears and Chaco, as well as other places. And dangers to the cultural heritage of the Standing Rock Sioux continue to be real. What is the content of our world that makes this emergency more apparent today? The more than 390 million indigenous peoples in some 90 countries today have lands that are about 22% of the Earth's surface, yet account for 80% of the Earth's biodiversity. Out of about 7,000 languages in the world, close to 5,000 are estimated to be indigenous peoples' languages, and experts tell us that about 90% are threatened with extinction in the next 100 years. Settler colonialism and domination that has plagued the indigenous peoples is not just a European invention, nor is it historic, meaning past and gone. Settler colonialism continues unabated in this country and elsewhere, with new acts, imposed invisibility on indigenous peoples, and refusal to respect, protect, and fulfill their fundamental human rights. Land grabbing of indigenous lands is happening as we speak, for example, through state-sponsored settlement of indigenous lands in Bangladesh's Chittagong Hill Tracts, or through so-called conservation projects, soon becoming money-making tools of extractive and other industries, and massively displaced indigenous peoples in Kenya and other countries, or through dams and other mega projects, as is the case in Nepal, India, Brazil, and elsewhere. Indigenous human rights and environmental advocates lose their lives in growing numbers. According to the 2017 report of an organization called Frontline Defenders, 67% of the total number of 312 activists killed in 27 countries the previous year were defending land, environmental, and indigenous people's rights, nearly always in the context of mega projects. The world-renowned indigenous leader Berta Cáceres in Honduras being one of those who lost their lives. Today, the dominant neoliberal development paradigm, with a weakened state and erosion of democratic processes and freedoms, focuses on extraction, a model of constantly rising consumption and growth that is over-harvesting the Earth's resources. As Oren Lyons, the Onondaga faith keeper, has often said, this is leading humanity to its precipice, to our own doom, as seen from environmental degradation and climate change. This unsustainable model of so-called development, led by barely controlled corporations and investment capital, is now placing perhaps the most imminent threat to the well-being of indigenous peoples around the globe, because it targets the Earth's remaining natural resources that are found on ancestral indigenous peoples' lands. Many states, more often than not, do their part to facilitate this by allowing and supporting, through laws, corruption, and use of force, the unchecked exploitation of indigenous peoples' resources by corporations. They also criminalize indigenous peoples' advocacy movements, as continues to be the case in Chile, in Russia, and elsewhere, and most recently in the Philippines, where Duterte's government placed hundreds of indigenous advocates on an alleged terrorist list in February 2018. To the shock of the whole world, the list included Victoria Tauli Corpus, a distinguished world-renowned Igorot leader from the Philippines, who is currently actually the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. But what is the significance and urgency of dealing with cultural heritage as a human right? First, it makes us see the human beings that are behind cultural heritage, their dignity, their history, their creativity, their spirituality, and their aspirations for the future that have created this heritage. Second, it links cultural heritage to the robust indigenous peoples movement. And third, a human rights approach gives us a well-established international normative framework of cultural and other human rights. It gives us tools of analysis, accountability, awareness, and solutions at national and international level. The mobilization around Bears Ears and Chaco is about indigenous peoples' human rights here and now. It is about their dignity. Walter Echo Hawk, a Pawnee lawyer at the Native American Rights Fund and professor at the University of Tulsa College of Law, in his book 2013 called In the Light of Justice, the Rise of Human Rights in Native America and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, he sees a new era emerging after the adoption of the Declaration. Echo Hawk, who was instrumental in securing passage of 2 federal laws that respect Indian religious freedom and the repatriation of Native American remains, believes that through the Declaration, through the human rights lens, we can see values that are higher than the state. Would we not be indignant in mainstream society if our cemeteries, churches, temples, and mosques were destroyed by corporations with the encouragement of states? Mr. Eagle, a military veteran from the Sioux tribe, while he was testifying in the case that the Standing Rock Sioux raised in connection with the Dakota Access Pipeline, compared the destruction of sacred sites by the pipeline to how he would feel, also as a veteran and as a Sioux, if someone were to dig through Arlington Cemetery. Quote, "To me and to members of the tribe, destruction of or disrespect to these sites feels just like it would feel to me if a pipeline was dug through the middle of Arlington National Cemetery, turning over gravestones and displacing graves. Mainstream society would not tolerate the destruction of Arlington National Cemetery. But this is what Dakota Access Pipeline is doing in the traditional lands of the Ossetis and Konkwin." Unquote. As the UN Special Rapporteur on Cultural Rights, Professor Karima Benoun, has said, erasing evidence of the presence of minorities, other peoples, philosophies, histories, religions, and beliefs, or deliberately targeting or terrorizing individuals and groups on the basis of their cultural, ethnic, or religious affiliation, or their ways of life and beliefs, are actually violations of human rights. These acts may be of different magnitudes, may be carried out systematically or sporadically, and may be part of a wider scheme to forcibly assimilate or deliberately kill a group of people. Unquote. The Bears Ears and Chaco struggles are linked to Standing Rock. They are linked to Wounded Knee in the past and to many previous struggles since the time of colonization that have inspired the indigenous movement in this country and around the world. So now let us catch that thread of history. In 1923, Cayuga Chief Descahe traveled to Geneva as the representative of the 6 nations of the Iroquois to the League of Nations, the precursor of the United Nations, to plead the cause of his people. He waited 1 year working for recognition by the League. He was not received and came back here in the US. A few months before his death in 1925, Chief Descahe made a speech by radio in Rochester, New York. The following is an excerpt, quote, "This is the story of the Mohawks, the story of the Oneidas, of the Cayugas, I am a Cayuga, of the Onondagas, the Senegas, and the Tuscaroras. They are the Iroquois. Tell it to those who have not been listening. Maybe I will be stopped from telling it, but if I am prevented from telling it over, as I hope I do, the story will not be lost. I have already told it to thousands of listeners in Europe. It has gone into the records where your children can find it when I may be dead or be in jail for daring to tell the truth. I have told this story in Switzerland. They have free speech in Little Switzerland. One can tell the truth over there in public, even if it is uncomfortable for some great people. I am the speaker of the 6 nations, the oldest League of Nations now existing. It's a league which is still alive and intends, as best it can, to defend the rights of the Iroquois to live under their own lands, in their own little countries now left to them, to worship their great spirit in their own way, and to enjoy the rights which are as surely theirs as the white man's rights are his own," unquote. A similar journey was made by Maori religious leader Ratana in 1925. He decided to protest the breaking of the Treaty of Waitangi concluded with the Maori in New Zealand in 1840 that gave Maori ownership of their lands, and he first traveled to London with a large delegation to petition King George, but he was denied access. He then sent part of his delegation to Geneva to the League of Nations as well, and arrived there later himself in 1925. Ratana was also denied access as well. I'm giving you this introduction to show that the history of indigenous peoples making their way to the institutions of the international community of nations, quote unquote, is old. Indigenous people's sense of themselves as sovereign nations, in parity with the other nations of the world, has always been very strong. The fact that states, the colonizing powers, concluded treaties with many indigenous peoples is a testimony that indigenous peoples were viewed as sovereign, not only by themselves, but also by those who actually invented modern international law, namely states. What was perhaps a lonely travel in the 1920s by these indigenous leaders has now become one of the most robust, perhaps the most successful international social movement of our times, based on human rights. In the post-Second World War era, states established in the UN Charter, in Article 1, established human rights along with peace and development as main goals of this organization. Indigenous peoples mobilized nationally, regionally, and internationally, especially since the 70s. They were inspired or strengthened by different waves of the times: decolonization, social justice, civil rights, struggles against racism and discrimination. And Native Americans played a major role in the formation and rise of the global indigenous movement, with Wounded Knee as a symbol. Let me now share some historic photos. From the very first gathering of indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere in the United Nations in Geneva in 1977. So this, what you see there, are indigenous peoples coming in. This is the main quad of the Palais des Nations, the main building of the United Nations in Geneva. And they came in full regalia with their elders, with their drums, holding staffs. 1977 was a major year for the Indigenous Movement. It was a year that regionally, nationally, regionally, and internationally, Indigenous peoples organized. And the epitome of that was in gathering in Geneva from this hemisphere in particular. The excuse was a World Conference Against Racism that was proclaimed by the UN. And apropos of that, they gathered. They decided to come to Geneva and state their cause. It was the first time in modern times that they did so. So here we see the people walking in. Some of the people are very famous leaders. They were young then. Some of them have passed away. Oren Lyons, that I have quoted just now, is walking there in the first row. This is also Oren Lyons. It happens to be Oren Lyons over there. Russell Means, also in front next to Oren. This is the room in which they met, and they put the first lines, or the 10 first principles of what they viewed as their human rights. It was their own articulation of their own human rights, which subsequently became the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in 2007. I have this picture in order to show you. This lady was the late Miss Shenandoah, Audra Shenandoah, from the Mohawks. She's holding the Haudenosaunee passport. The Haudenosaunee, the Confederacy of Six Nations, traveled to Geneva at that time, and still, under their passport. This is a signal of their sovereignty as Native American nations. And this passport today is recognized by about 22 countries. So I would like, yeah. All right. So I wanted to share these photographs and give us a little flavor of all this through also the images. So in that gathering, as I told you, they put together the first principles of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which was negotiated from 1982 to 2007 at the United Nations. For 25 years, it was a negotiation unprecedented between indigenous peoples and states, while normally the UN is a forum that is a negotiation among states, but this time it became a negotiating place between indigenous peoples and states. So political and legal developments regarding indigenous peoples have galloped in the last 2 decades. While there is no time now to speak of those in any detail, suffices to say here that the Indigenous Peoples Movement has achieved the creation of a major and unique international human rights instrument, the Declaration, extraordinary procedures of participation at the United Nations, the creation of 3 indigenous-specific mechanisms at the UN, including the UN Permanent Forum on indigenous issues, where indigenous peoples participate at a level of parity with states, and huge political but also moral visibility as the indigenous peoples' cause continues to keep the moral high ground, and indigenous peoples continue to advocate not only for respect of their rights, but also for alternative paradigms of well-being, development, and coexistence, el vivir bien, el suma causai in Spanish and Quechua, that calls for harmony with nature, harmony with community, and with self. While in the early 90s, early 80s, about 20 people from non-governmental organizations attended the first UN meeting on the topic. It was called then Working Group on Indigenous Populations. Now more than 1,000 indigenous leaders attend the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues that meets in New York every spring. Actually, 1,400 people attended this past spring. Let me now underline for sure, so that I put it on the table, that the human rights framework has played a tremendous catalytic role in the internationalization of indigenous peoples' issues. And these UN-related processes have prompted the creation of an international indigenous identity and the transformation of local indigenous movements into a global one. Now, bringing cultural heritage in focus, let me devote a few words about how cultural heritage should be defined and who defines it. Significant progress on the concept of cultural heritage, both tangible and intangible, as a human right, was made through the contribution of the first independent expert of the UN Human Rights Council on cultural rights. Her name, Ms. Farida Shahid. In her report to the Council in 2011, she focused on the right to access and enjoyment of cultural heritage. In addition, we should say that the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights in 2011 also analyzed this topic. Now, specifically on the concept of cultural heritage as a human right, the following excerpts from the rapporteur's report summarize her analysis. Quote, "Beyond preserving, safeguarding an object or a manifestation in itself, the human rights approach to cultural heritage obliges one to take into account the rights of individuals and communities in relation to such object or manifestation, and in particular, to connect cultural heritage with its source of production. Cultural heritage is linked to human dignity and identity. Accessing and enjoying cultural heritage is an important feature of being a member of a community, a citizen, and more widely, a member of society." There are various understandings of cultural heritage. The independent expert describes cultural heritage as tangible heritage, for example, sites, structures, and remains of archaeological, historical, religious, cultural, and aesthetic value. Intangible heritage, for instance, traditions, customs, and practices, aesthetic and spiritual beliefs, vernacular or other languages, artistic expressions, folklore. And natural heritage, for example, protected natural reserves, other protected biologically diverse areas, historic parks and gardens, and cultural landscapes. The concept of heritage reflects the dynamic character of something that has been developed, built or created, interpreted and reinterpreted in history, and transmitted from generation to generation. Cultural heritage links the past, the present, and the future, as it encompasses things inherited from the past that are considered to be of such value or significance today that individuals and communities want to transmit them to future generations. Let me now turn to the question, what specifically a human rights approach to indigenous cultural heritage means? What tools of analysis and action does it provide? Thanks to the advocacy of indigenous peoples, 17 of the 46 articles of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples are linked to the cultural rights of indigenous peoples, making the Declaration the boldest recognition of detailed cultural rights that we have in international law. Let me say why this is significant. Since the time of the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide from 46 to 48, states have resisted the explicit recognition of cultural rights for decades. In cultural rights, in culture, states saw an existential threat to the so-called nation state. They saw collectivities and groups, whether indigenous or minorities, that could undermine the Westphalian state. Lurking in states' minds was the notion that by destroying cultural heritage in its many manifestations, including languages and religions or sacred sites, they would dominate over groups. Dramatically, reference to ethnocide and reference to minority rights, including the protection and free use of languages, were both deliberately excluded from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and from the Anti-Genocide Convention. This is why we hail today the fact that in the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, we have such bold recognition of cultural rights. The Declaration's adoption has historical, moral, political, and legal significance. It resets the relationship between indigenous peoples and states, paving the path to the decolonization of indigenous peoples. The Declaration has three pillars: the right to self-determination, rights to lands, territories, and resources, and cultural rights. So, whatever we discuss that has to do with indigenous peoples, we have to approach at least through these three basic pillars, perspectives. What are now the main norms in the Declaration regarding cultural heritage? Thought I would share with you the text so that they're a bit more clear here. Article 12 says that indigenous peoples have the right to manifest, practice, develop, and teach their spiritual and religious traditions, customs, and ceremonies, and right to maintain, protect, and have access in privacy to their religious and cultural sites, the right to the use and control of their ceremonial objects, and the right to the repatriation of their human remains. States shall seek to enable the access and/or repatriation of ceremonial objects and human remains in their possession through fair, transparent, and effective mechanisms developed in conjunction with indigenous peoples concerned. Article 31 states that indigenous peoples have the right to maintain, control, protect, and develop their cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, and traditional cultural expressions, as well as the manifestations of their sciences, technologies, and cultures, including human and genetic resources, seeds, medicines, knowledge of the properties of fauna and flora, oral traditions, literatures, designs, sports and traditional games, and visual and performing arts. Article 25 says, indigenous peoples have the right to maintain and strengthen their distinctive spiritual relation with their traditionally owned or otherwise occupied and used lands, territories, waters, and coastal seas and other resources, and to uphold their responsibilities to future generations in that regard. And Article 26 states that indigenous peoples have the right to their lands, territories, and resources which they have traditionally owned, occupied, or otherwise used or acquired. Now, embedded in indigenous peoples' rights to self-determination is their right to free, prior, and informed consent. This right is explicitly provided in the Declaration as a protection for the most crucial aspects of their lives and well-being, of their existence. And this includes, one of those areas is precisely the protection of cultural heritage. So Article 11 says this: indigenous peoples have the right to practice and revitalize their cultural traditions and customs. This includes the right to maintain, protect, and develop the past, present, and future manifestations of their cultures, such as archaeological and historical sites, artifacts, designs, ceremonies, technologies, and visual and performing arts and literature. And then it says, here is the important reference, states shall provide redress through effective mechanisms, which may include restitution, developed in conjunction with indigenous peoples with respect to their cultural, intellectual, religious, and spiritual property taken without their free, prior, and informed consent or in violation of their laws, traditions, and customs. So cultural heritage in a human rights framework places it as part of a significant international human rights system of concepts, norms, and avenues for action. And I will mention 7 points and finish. First, the human rights area constitutes the most codified area in international law. We have about 100 international human rights instruments in international law that speak about the obligations of states to respect, protect, fulfill the rights of people. Second, a number of human rights treaty bodies exist, as well as international human rights special rapporteurs that systematically monitor the implementation of human rights treaties and other instruments, including cultural heritage. These mechanisms include the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Victoria Tauli-Corpus, who actually did a visit to Standing Rock in February 2017 and reported to the UN General Assembly. And it also includes the Special Rapporteur on Cultural Rights, Dr. Karima Benoun, who is a law professor at UC Davis. Third, the human rights approach elevates cultural heritage protection to an international human rights obligation of states. It also underlines protection of cultural heritage rights as part of historic remedies owed to indigenous peoples for the historic injustices to which they have been subjected. Hence, cultural heritage is surrounded, so to speak, by a panoply of rights that help enrich and deepen its normative content and that require a different approach focusing on human dignity. This approach evokes the responsibility of the state. It means that the state is obliged to take measures to respect, protect, and fulfill cultural heritage-related rights. In other words, this cannot be left to the forces of the market and to commercial exploitation. Fourth, the human rights approach to cultural heritage connects cultural heritage with its source of production, to people. It makes people visible. People that settler, colonial, and other forms of domination have tried to eclipse to the margins of society. This invisibility constitutes systemic discrimination, as we know. Cultural heritage is linked to human dignity and identity. Accessing and enjoying cultural heritage is a human right, an important feature of being a member of a community, a citizen, and more widely, a member of society. Fifth, the human rights approach to cultural heritage brings in the governance issue related to heritage. Governance reminds immediately of the right to self-determination of indigenous peoples. Cultural heritage, as both an individual and a collective human right, brings in the obligation of the state to consult indigenous peoples through their own representative institutions before any action that would impact on their cultural heritage, whether this is a geographical place that is sacred site with spiritual or religious significance, a monument or an object or any kind of tangible or intangible heritage. Lack of consultation and free prior informed consent is a human rights violation and has contributed to this invisibility, trivialization, and destruction of cultural heritage of groups rendered marginal, and has undermined the deep moral aspect and significance of cultural heritage for persons and groups, seeing them sometimes just as state property, which has been, for example, at some point in Machu Picchu was viewed only as such state property, but it's not the only one. Significantly, the human rights approach stresses the importance of individuals and communities, including indigenous peoples, in defining and stewarding cultural heritage, but also in defining what constitutes destruction of cultural heritage. Only the people whose cultural heritage it is are able to speak with authority about what is destruction of this heritage. Sixth, cultural heritage as a human right also means rejecting the colonial doctrine of discovery, a doctrine that saw indigenous peoples' lands as empty lands, as terra nullius. Terra nullius and public domain for intellectual and cultural production are both property rights doctrines designed to favor Western European style land use, according to Matthias Arendt. By analogy of the original dogma of colonization, for many in the dominant society, traditional knowledge seems to be there to be occupied and exploited as a kind of terra nullius, since the communities who own this knowledge come from different cultures and legal customs and happen to be viewed as marginal, expected to conform and bow to the patterns of the dominant societies and legal systems. Seventh and last, but not least, cultural heritage, and this is new in the international legal system. Cultural heritage as an individual and collective right provides the link between destruction of cultural heritage and not only state responsibility, but also individual international criminal accountability under the statute of the International Criminal Court. And a recent groundbreaking and precedent-setting decision of the ICC underlines this point. We have all welcomed the decision of the Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court to charge the destruction of cultural and religious sites as a standalone crime for the first time in the case of Al-Mahdi. The ICC found Al-Mahdi in 2016 guilty for ordering the destruction of mausoleums that were of cultural significance for the indigenous community in Mali. In ending this introduction, I would like to say that we have seen an impressive mobilization around Bears Ears and Chaco in this country, with some success until now. Indigenous nations concerned can, of course, strategize about the possible internationalization of the issues of threats to their cultural heritage by appealing to the available international human rights mechanisms, including the Special Rapporteur on Indigenous Peoples' Rights, as well as the Human Rights Council itself and the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. However, I feel that much more needs to be done to raise awareness of state actors and of society as a whole on the significance of these monuments, of sacred sites, and of indigenous cultural heritage overall. We have to galvanize the understanding of society that it is the human dignity of our fellow human beings that is behind this heritage. This is a moral emergency that I referred to in the title of this presentation. This is a social and political struggle that resists the monetization of all aspects of life and seeks meaning in a well-being with culture for indigenous peoples and for all of us. It's about recognizing the humanity in the others and thus reaffirming ours. Tara Benali of the Navajo Nation said a few months ago, quote, "Losing Bears Ears to a cloud of industrial smoke from extraction and mining does not keep the preservation of life for us," unquote. And cultural heritage is about life. Thank you very much.